life. Today is February the 4th, 2025, and I'm reading Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. This is a book about contact with extraterrestrials. I'm in the first chapter, Preposterous Propositions, and Stuart Holroyd, who wrote this book, went to Ossining, where Andrija Puharich had an estate, and also Sir John Whitmore. And he met Sir John, and he did not meet Andrija, but he was quite interested in the phenomenon of contact with extraterrestrials, and he suggested he might write a book. Anyway, a little bit of time has gone by, and he himself is going through the various possibilities of what he has learned. Furthermore, the sober calculations of astrophysicists and exobiologists of the possibilities of the existence of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe are staggering. Dr. Frank Drake of Cornell estimates that 1 in 10 million stars possesses a detectable civilization. This modest figure would yield a total of between 100,000 and 1 million in our galaxy alone. That a proportion of these should be older and technologically more advanced civilizations than ours is a possibility that can hardly be dismissed out of hand without incurring a charge of narrow-minded planetary chauvinism. Our own space technology is barely 15 years old. This was published in 1977. And the Apollo project of landing men on the moon was accomplished within 6 years of its inception. So who is to say that other civilizations possessed of aeons of technological expertise in advance of ours might not exist, and long ago have conquered interstellar space and evolved technologies beyond the boldest imaginings of our scientists and science fiction writers? These were some of the facts and arguments that disposed me to take more seriously than I had on the day I visited Ossining the idea that the communications may not be fraud, delusions, or a parapsychological phenomenon, but precisely what John and Andrija believed them to be, messages from the space people. I could think of a score of reasons why the propositions was absurd, but there was the remotest possibility that it might be true. It was obviously worth investigating the evidence more deeply. When I accepted the invitation to be the chronicler of the Ossining group's adventure, I confess that just for a moment I entertained the thought that it would be stupid to pass up a possible opportunity to be a witness to a new apocalypse. But I suppressed the thought no sooner than it surfaced, well aware that of all the tutelary spirits I could choose to accompany me on this particular venture, the most inappropriate would be those that bore the names Faith and Hope. Since the above pages were written, 9 months have elapsed. I have listened to the recordings of all the communications, participated in some myself, and completed this book, and I would now like to add a few pages to this introductory chapter in the light of these experiences. I was apprehensive when I embarked on this book, that I might reach a point where I could no longer continue with the work. It was possible that, when I had heard more of the material and had analyzed it and thought about it, I would become convinced that a perfectly normal, or what I have called a normal paranormal explanation of it could be plausibly adduced, in which case I would be obliged by the ethics of intellectual integrity to wield Occam's razor and cut out all extravagant hypotheses such as the existence of extraterrestrials. But this hasn't happened. Increasing familiarity with the material of the communications and with the people involved has only consolidated my feeling that this is one of the most remarkable true stories that any writer ever had dropped into his lap, and also increased my puzzlement as to where the communications could emanate from, if not from the alleged extraterrestrial intelligence. When I first visited Ossining, and John said with a laugh that he wondered whether my appearance at that time was as casual as it seemed, and whether the management might not have a plan to use me in some way, I frankly thought him crackers. But when I listened to the tapes, I understood why the thought might have occurred to him. 2 days before I visited Ossining, in fact, on the very day that I arrived in New York, and before I had contacted John, he and Andrija were told in a communication, "There will be those that will come to you this weekend that will be of benefit. There will be a time when they will talk, when they will walk away, moving their head back and forth, and will not understand. But then they will sit and they will think, and they will have an experience, and they will begin to understand, and then they will work with you. We have decided that those that work with you must begin to have experiences, for them to have understanding. There are not many in your physical world that operate on faith, as you do, Sir John." When I asked John whether anyone else had visited Ossining that weekend, he couldn't recall whether anyone had, but he was certain that no one had visited who had later become involved in the work. He had quite forgotten about the prediction in the communication held on the Friday, but when I drew his attention to it, he said, "I'm sure that was intended for you." Well, maybe. After listening through all the tapes, I have become inured to the shock of seeing an extraordinary prediction fulfilled. The rest of the above-quoted prediction is true too. That is, if this was intended for me. I did walk away shaking my head, and I did have a couple of experiences of seemingly paranormal effect, though these did not contribute to my understanding so much as to my perplexity. I will relate them because this kind of thing is an integral part of the story, and I trust that a straight reportage might not be misconstrued as advocacy. These things happened, and nothing remotely like them had ever happened in my experience before. But the only ground I had for associating them with the management is that they happened when they did. The first was a poltergeist type of event. It happened in October 1975, not long after I had received the first parcel of specimen material from John. And at that time, when I was debating with myself whether I could undertake this book, late one night, I, my wife, and a friend watched a television program in the sitting room of my home. The program had a soporific effect on the other two, but I watched it through, and at the end walked across the room and switched off the set. I then turned and spoke to the others, and our friend woke up, and at that moment a potted plant on the mantelpiece behind me literally jumped out into the room and landed at my feet. When I realized what had happened, I said to our friend, "Did you see that?" He said yes, he had seen it. The plant had jumped off the mantelpiece. We sought a normal explanation. The only possible one was that I had knocked the plant off after switching off the television, but to have done so would have required a most unnatural up and round swing of the arm, which I was certain I had not performed. Moreover, the plant, which I later ascertained weighed just over 5 pounds, had not been toppled, but seemed to have been lifted, for it landed upright 2 or 3 feet away from the mantelpiece, and the saucer in which it stood was undisturbed. I remember some of the tales I had heard about paranormal events at Ossining and around Uri, and I wondered. The second event occurred when I had already begun working on the book. I played through one of the cassette types of communication, making notes and transcribing relevant portion. As I did so, I left the cassette in my player and did some writing, and later in the day I wound back to check a point, but now the track was completely blank. It certainly could not have been erased normally in the interim, and it was not until later that I discovered that this particular communication was one of the very few of which there existed a duplicate copy, which suggests that it was deliberately selected for demonstration purposes. I was impressed, much more impressed than I had been by reading Andrija's accounts of the more sensational teleportation and dematerialization events that had occurred in connection with Yuri, which is the reason I don't expect anyone else to be particularly impressed by these two anecdotes, though I think I had to report them, as they were events that influenced my attitude to the work and the communication. Another influence has been my own experience of communication sessions. I have participated in 7 sessions over the past 9 months. This is not the context to report them in detail, but perhaps a description of what a typical session is like will help the reader to have a mental picture of what is going on when communications are summarized in later chapters. The first communication I participated in was at STUART Hall, the former Whitmore ancestral home in Essex, now owned by John's close friend Tony Morgan. Phyllis had arrived from New York the previous day. I had formed an impression of a capable, resourceful extrovert and probably rather formidable woman. To my relief, I was wrong. Unostentatiously casual in dress and manner, rather short of stature, with short blonde hair styled for convenience, talkative, fun-loving, down-to-earth, Phyllis seemed as normal and nice a person as one could meet. She is, but she is also something more. She prefers to work late, so it was about 1 o'clock in the morning when she, John, and I left the other members of the weekend house party talking in the drawing room and went upstairs to Phyllis' room. She and John made the necessary preparations, arranging 3 upright chairs in close proximity, fixing the recording equipment and putting on the copper bracelets that they had been instructed always to wear during these sessions. During and for some time after these preparations, we continued the conversation we had been engaged in downstairs, which had nothing to do with our present purpose. Then John said we had better begin. Phyllis stubbed out her cigarette, composed herself in an upright posture, with her hands resting on her knees, and said she was ready, whereupon John switched off the room lights and placed a small torch in a position where it afforded us dim illumination, but did not cast a direct light in Phyllis' direction. Phyllis began counting down from 45, her voice becoming softer and slower until she fell silent. Her head slumped forward and to the left, and her hands fell loosely down at her sides. She remained thus for a minute or two, and then, very slowly, her head rose, her back straightened, and her forearms came up to a horizontal position, so that she was sitting as if holding a tray, but with the palm of her hands turned inwards towards each other. Then her voice whispered, "We are here," very low, completely exhaling on the last word. John said, "Greetings, Tom," and introduced me. Tom is the name that the spokesman for the communicators had adopted for convenience of address, and here and in the sequel I shall also use it for convenience. Phyllis' voice soon became stronger, and though her Tom delivered a courteous, indeed flattering long speech of welcome to me, the ending of the speech and the invitation to put a question were indicated by Phyllis' hand being lowered to her knee and Tom saying yes. I was impressed by Tom's eloquence, and I was both impressed and surprised to be told at one point in the communication precisely what I had been thinking. Tom said, "Now into your mind at this moment comes the thought that you wonder what you are doing, communicating with us, and if it is in truth another from a distant place that is speaking to you." That was indeed what I was thinking. The main subject of this communication was the present book. I was given to believe that my meeting John, when I did, was not fortuitous, and that I could bring certain qualities into reporting the communications which someone more closely involved would not be able to contribute, not the least among which were, doubt, skepticism, and objectivity. You will be able to put the question that will occur to people, Tom said. This is a point I have continually borne in mind while writing this book. Probably the main initial credibility hurdle for readers of this book will be that communications from an extraterrestrial intelligence should come through a trance medium. And to conclude this chapter, I propose to make a few observations on trance mediumship in general, and on Phyllis in particular. What we are asked to believe happens when Phyllis is in deep trance is that she leaves her body, and that Tom, the spokesman for the communicators, takes over control of her body and her voice mechanism. What we see happen is certainly consistent with this explanation, and the content of the communications is certainly such as to make nonsense of any simplistic skeptic's suspicion that it is all clever play acting on Phyllis's part. But neither the content nor the observed events, nor the combination of the two, conclusively proves that this is in fact what happens. So we have to consider whether we have available any way round a simple, believe it or not, option, to ask whether there is any other evidence we can call on, which may at least affect the balance of probabilities, even if it does not constitute a final elucidation of the truth of the matter. We have three categories of such evidence: well-authenticated precedents from the literature of psychic research, certain statements that Phyllis has made about her trance experiences when she has returned to a normal waking state of consciousness, and relevant statements made in the communication themselves. Let us then see how the balance of probabilities is affected if we consider in turn the separate statements: A, that Phyllis leaves her body during trance, and B, that Tom takes possession of her body and control of its functions. We have ample evidence for the reality of out-of-the-body experiences, or to use an older and today less fashionable term, astral projections. The voluminous case records and scrupulous analysis of Dr. Robert Krukol, the testimonies of experiences such as Sylvan Malden, Oliver Fox, and Robert Monroe, and the recent experimental researches of Dr. Pusoff and Park of the Stanford Research Institute, and of Professor Charles T. Tart at the University of California, not to mention the many testimonies of people who have undergone pseudo-death experiences and been brought back to life, have established beyond doubt that there is a component of human personality, the bit of me that counts, as one experient called it, that in certain circumstances can separate from the physical body, leaving the latter merely an envelope or shell. The experience of separation of our essential self from our physical body that occurs somewhere between the many unseen bodies that are said to exist, such as the astral and the etheric, is in fact by no means uncommon. And although for most people who have them, such experiences are involuntary and rare, some people have learned and developed techniques for effecting separation at will. So the claim that during trance Phyllis leaves her body is neither outrageous nor inherently improbable. Most times I'm not anywhere, Phyllis says, referring to the times when she's in trance. She usually returns to normal consciousness as from a deep and dreamless sleep. She never has any recollection of the words she has spoken, but sometimes she retains vivid impressions of places she has visited while out of the body, and very often her post-session reports of her out-of-the-body experiences closely correspond with the information contained in the related communications. Some examples of these correspondences will be brought to the reader's attention in later chapters. The point I want to make here is that they constitute at least prima facie evidence for the authenticity of both the information and the post-session report. If we accept on the basis of the evidence of physical research and of her own testimony that Phyllis may indeed leave her body when in trance, the next question to consider is whether the vacated body and its functions can be taken over by an external agency. On this subject, a very interesting statement was made by Tom in a communication in January 1975. The other whom we communicate through is a physical transmitter, and it has to be a being that is willing, that will become passive in order for us to become active. In order to communicate with you, we must take over the subconscious of the being and at the same time control the physical body. We must, with great effort, maintain a balance in the body. We must cause the body to have its heart operating, its lungs breathing, and all its major organs functioning. The reason for the drain of energy many times from the two of you is that we are maintaining the body in a suspended state. The second occasion when I personally participated in a communication was at a remote old house in South Hertfordshire, and when Phyllis was coming out of trance, she moaned, sobbed, rolled her head and screamed in a way that I found most alarming. John, who had conducted the session, did not appear to be perturbed by this performance, however. He held Phyllis' hand firmly and said, "I command the immediate release of this being," and the symptoms of distress very quickly abated. "Tell us what happened," John said, when Phyllis was fully conscious, and she told us a harrowing story about having to battle with another entity for possession of her body when she returned to it. "They're still all around us," she said, and I confess I looked around the room with some apprehension, but of course I saw nothing. I asked what were all around, and Phyllis explained that when a human channel is open, scores of spirit and elementals rush to the spot like wasps to a jam pot, seeking to take possession and get back onto the physical plane. John added, I thought with impressive nonchalance, that there was nothing to worry about really, because the physical is always stronger than the psychical, and the would-be intruders could be driven off with a few well-chosen words, which I thought was nice to know and could come in useful someday. But the point of this anecdote is that for Phyllis, the possibility of possession by alien entities is very much a reality. It had been a reality too for many people involved in psychical research. To survey the evidence here would require too long a digression, and I can only recommend anyone concerned to pursue the matter to consult Richard Hodgson's report on the Luramsey venoms, the Watseka wonder, a case, or Dr. Ian Stevenson on the case of Jaspier Yacht, James Hislop, who was Professor of Logic and Ethics at the Columbia University, as well as a notable psychical researcher, wrote that although he had fought against the idea for 10 years, he was finally unable to reject the conclusion that, in a number of cases, persona whose condition would ordinarily be described as due to hysteria, dual or multiple personality, dementia precox, paranoia, or some other form of mental disturbance, showed unmistakable indications of invasion by foreign or discarnate agencies. Hislop means spirits, but his foreign agencies could just as well have been extraterrestrial intelligences. In the light of the evidence surveyed in the above paragraphs, I suggest that we may consider the antecedent improbability of the proposition that in trance Phyllis leaves her body and Tom takes over greatly diminished. If the reader agrees, he will have cleared the first of the credibility hurdles, and if he stays, With this narrative, the exercise will serve him in good stead, for there are more and much bigger hurdles to come. Hello, my darling. Oh, this is the end. The chapter 2 is the forming of the triangle. Hi, Pippi. Have a good Tuesday.